Well, President Obama was enough to take his message of financial reform right into the lion's den on Wall Street. So with money on the mind, many observers are suggesting that if the president is serious about slashing the national debt, he's going to have to increase taxes. Carly Fiorina is the former chief executive of HP. She joins us now from Los Angeles to talk about these financial matters. Carly, always great to see you.
Great to be with you, Shannon. Good afternoon.
Well, let me ask you, I think it's probably still morning where you are, but thank you for jumping ahead a couple times.
Yes, it is.
Let me ask you, what did you make of the president's message and kind of the pillars he outlined for financial reform this week in Wall Street?
Well, you know, it's clearly good politics right now to beat up on Wall Street, and taxpayers, voters are outraged about what happened on Wall Street, particularly because Main Street still isn't getting enough credit. However, I think we're rushing to judgment here without taking into account what really caused this problem. Yes, Wall Street was a huge part of this problem. Capital markets will not work well without transparency and accountability, and there were insufficient amounts of both on Wall Street. However, Fannie and Freddie own 50%, over 50% now of the nation's mortgages. They were a huge part of this problem. This financial reform bill does nothing to look at Fannie and Freddie. And secondly, we have over 20 plus agencies that were responsible for preventing fraud and abuse and Wall Street collapse. They didn't do their job. The answer, in my mind, is not to ignore all that and create yet another huge bureaucracy that the American taxpayer will end up paying for. And that's what this bill essentially does. Let's go back and understand why those 20 plus agencies didn't do their job. Let's make sure they do their job in the future. Another huge bureaucracy which will cost the American taxpayer even more money, I don't think is the answer here.
And speaking of costing us all more money, let's talk about what's called the value-added tax. Members of the administration haven't said that the president is considering it or thinking about it, but they also say, well, he's not considering it or not thinking about it. What do you make of that if it does come to fruition?
Well, you know, this is why I oppose the creation of this Deficit Reduction Commission in the first place. Because a Deficit Reduction Commission, first, is taking the heat off of our elected representatives. The senators and congressmen that we send to Washington ought to be doing their job. But secondly, a Deficit Reduction Commission is code for let's figure out how to raise taxes. I think a value-added tax would be ridiculous. I think the last thing we need to be doing here is raising taxes. It's why I signed the Taxpayer Protection Pledge as a candidate for the U.S. Senate. A value-added tax merely lets the government off the hook. We need to hold Washington, D.C. accountable for each and every dollar of American taxpayer money they spend, and we're not doing that today. That's why I think we need to get some new people in Washington, D.C.
Well, let me ask you, you mentioned the Debt Commission, which is going to have its first meeting this week. Do you think there's any chance that it does accomplish something, that any good comes from that process in those meetings?
Well, I think what the Deficit Commission is clearly going to highlight is that we have a huge and unsustainable level of debt. The answer to that debt problem, $12.5 trillion now, going to $20 trillion within the decade, I think there are only two solutions to that problem. One, we have to grow the economy, which means cutting taxes, not raising taxes. And two, we have to cut federal spending. We actually have to begin cutting federal spending. And that means, I believe, holding our representatives in Washington, D.C. accountable for each and every dollar of American taxpayer money they spend.
All right, Carly Fiorina, also in a GOP primary fight right now for a Senate seat out of the state of California. We know that's coming up June 8th. We will be watching closely. Thanks for joining us today.
Great. Thanks for having me.